Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be doing an expose on 3 different posts in regards to race and ethnic relations. Well, I will be fact checking them. The first post I have is a post of Charlie Kirk criticizing Civil Rights Act, and I will be fact checking that through the lens of critical race theory.
Condemn the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a huge mistake.
Correct.
Why do you believe it was a mistake to pass anti-discrimination legislation? And what do you think would be better policy for being treated fairly and equally, which you see as an American principle?
Yeah, nothing against the intent, but it was too broadly written and it played into something called disparate impact. Disparate impact was woven within the Civil Rights Act, and disparate impact basically says if two racial groups have different outcomes, the answer must be racism. It does not allow any legal nuance. So there are 4 components to, quote-unquote, the anti-racist regime of America. I don't pretend to know what goes on in this country. I could just talk about America. I'm sure that's fine. And it's 4 components: affirmative action, critical race theory, DEI, and disparate impact. Those are the kind of the 4 components. All of them have their subsection. The Civil Rights Act led the way to affirmative action, which is weaponized, quote-unquote, reverse racism against Asian and white people. And the Civil Rights Act also blazed the trail for disparate impact as a legal theory, basically saying that if black Americans are doing worse in a group, it might not be because of marital differences or cultural differences or single motherhood issues. It must be racism. And so because of that, the Civil Rights Act was too broadly written. So the intent, it should have been a single page or a 2-page bill to say that you cannot discriminate against based on the color of somebody's skin, period, end of story. Instead, we get a multiple 100-page bill with lots of chapters and lots of lesser-known amendments that created basically a permanent anti-racist bureaucracy within our federal government to go find racism where it doesn't exist and create it new places where otherwise did not exist.
Okay, so when Charlie Kirk talks about the Civil Rights Act, he comes from what critical race theory would call a not racist perspective, rather than an anti-racist one. His stance echoes the common claim that we saw in the lecture video: I'm not responsible for creating racial hierarchy and I'm not actively maintaining it, so racial equality isn't my fault. But CRT argues that racism isn't just about individual intentions. It's about structures, institutions, etc. that continue shaping outcomes today. So simply declaring oneself not racist or making a law that tells people to just not be racist doesn't disrupt the system that produces unequal results. Kirk argues that the Civil Rights Act should have been a single sentence: don't discriminate based on skin color, period. But CRT shows why this is naive. A one-line, colorblind law ignores the racial hierarchy that existed and still exists in the United States and all over the world. It also ignores how laws, schools, housing systems, etc. were already structured to advantage people racialized as white. CRT scholars like Derek Bell emphasize that unless you actually address the hierarchy, formally equal rules will reproduce unequal conditions. Kirk's proposed simplicity also erases the anti-racist approaches needed to produce real equity. Things like intergroup contact, education, organizational development, and wider institutional reform. Anti-racist work is active. It involves changing structures, not just declaring neutrality. More importantly, from a CRT perspective, his dismissal of racial disparities denies the lived experience of people racialized as Black. In Dr. K's lecture, we learned that CRT insists that we must examine how institutions like policing, education, housing, and employment reinforce racial hierarchy. CRT rejects explanations that blame inequality on things that Charlie Kirk said, such as single motherhood, cultural differences, or marital issues, because these narratives divert attention away from systemic causes. In other words, Kirk frames inequality as the fault of Black communities themselves, not as the outcome of structures that have historically excluded them. That's exactly the kind of narrative CRT critiques as maintaining racial hierarchy when appearing neutral. The Civil Rights Act, although imperfect, was written from a more anti-racist perspective, an attempt to challenge institutional discrimination, not just individual prejudice. By contrast, Kirk reframes it into a not racist approach, where no one needs to take responsibility for structural inequality and no active intervention is needed. But CRT would argue that a broad statement like "don't discriminate" leads to little to no systemic change. Colorblindness without structural change simply preserves the status quo. If we do not actively educate, challenge discriminatory institutions, and build equitable policies, then people's attitudes and the systems that protect inequality will remain unchanged. So when Kirk argues that the Civil Rights Act went too far, CRT would say that he's ignoring the deeper reality, that racial hierarchy does not dismantle itself, and neutrality is not the same as justice. Structural racism requires structural solutions, not a one-sentence law and a hope that discrimination will magically disappear. Okay, now we'll head into the next video by the older millennial on TikTok.
For a second, people. The colonization of North America is one of the greatest things to ever happen. It's one of the greatest things to ever happen to the world. Never has colonization ever been so unbelievably successful and led to such amazing outcomes as the colonization of the North American continent. Because it led to the creation of the United States of America. And if we just take a look around the world, how many countries in the world right now are only existing and are only able to feed their people, are only able to take care of their people because of the United States? I think we explained that really well with the canceling of USAID. Like, we showed how many countries are just fucked without us. The United States of America subsidizes a very large part of this planet. There are people in other countries that would just die without our aid, without the benefits they get from the United States. And the only way that became possible was the colonization of the North American continent. And I'm not even gonna listen to the bullshit of people being like, oh, we took it from the peaceful people that were here. They weren't peaceful. They were massacring each other. They were enslaving each other. They were not some peaceful people just living on the plains and living in touch with nature. No, they were fucking each other up on a regular basis. And then the settlers showed up and showed them what ass kicking really looked like. And then they proceeded to build the greatest nation in the history of the world. Colonization is awesome. All the best places in the world have been colonized. And they are still only the best places in the world because they were colonized. So look, y'all can complain about colonization all you want. For me personally, I take the term colonizer as a compliment.
Okay, so when we talk about Indigenous peoples, it's important to recognize their relationship to the land is not just about physical territory. It is cultural, spiritual, and deeply relational. The land is where knowledge is passed down, where traditions are practiced, and where communities sustain and protect one another. Indigenous people nurture the land, and in turn it nurtures them, as we've learned in the lecture videos. So when colonizers arrive and claim that land as their own, they don't just take space, they sever a relationship. They rip people away from their cultural foundations, their practices, and their sense of identity. Colonization imposes foreign policies, foreign systems, and foreign values onto Indigenous nations, and this imposition is not gentle. It is enforced through violence, displacement, and exploitation. In the video, the older millennial tries to justify colonization by saying Indigenous groups were already violent towards one another, even claiming they were enslaving each other. Even if we assume those claims have some accuracy, which many scholars contest, that argument ignores a basic ethical principle. Violence within a community does not justify greater violence from outside of it. The presence of conflict does not make cultural erasure acceptable. It does not make the destruction of language, ceremony, governance system, and kinship networks somehow good. Colonization was not a civilizing mission. It was cultural genocide, as we learned in the lecture video. It erased Indigenous relationships to the land and replaced them with systems of ownership, extraction, and private property that benefited colonizers. The older millennial says that any country without colonization would be, excuse my French, fucked. But that argument dismisses thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge, stewardship, and survival. Indigenous nations thrived long before colonizers arrived, and they did so without the environmental degradation and hierarchical violence that the colonial structures brought with them. In reality, colonization worsened life for the Indigenous people. It forced them to abandon their languages, follow foreign cultural practices, and live under political systems designed to suppress them. The consequences of this, including land theft, family separation, and forced assimilation, have created deep generational trauma that Indigenous communities continue to confront today. So when the older millennial says colonization was the best thing that ever happened to the world, he is overlooking a simple truth. The benefits of colonization were not shared. They were experienced almost exclusively by those racialized as white. For Indigenous peoples, colonization meant loss of land, culture, language, autonomy, and life. Understanding colonization requires seeing both sides of that history, just not those who benefited from it. All right, and the last post I will be fact checking is a screenshot of a caption of a TikTok, and I will show it now. In the TikTok caption by @ben.mllc, he argues that there is no genocide happening in Gaza because Israel is targeting Hamas, not Palestinians as a group. But when we examine this claim through genocide studies, the definitions we've learned in this class, the situation becomes more complex, and the argument he makes leaves out key legal and academic considerations. First, when we learned about the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it defines genocide as acts committed with an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. Importantly, the convention lists 5 types of genocidal acts, and only one of them involves killing. Genocide can also include causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about a group's destruction, preventing births, and forcefully transferring children. So genocide does not require wiping out an entire group, nor does it require explicit verbal declarations of extermination. In whole or in part means that destroying a portion of a protected group, especially in a specific region, qualifies as genocide. When the creator claims that Israel's actions target Hamas, not Palestinians, that doesn't align with what scholars call cultural genocide. Cultural genocide refers to the destruction of social, cultural, and political foundations of a group, their institutions, traditions, infrastructure, and collective life. Even if a state claims to be targeting a terrorist organization, the effects on the civilian population matters. In Gaza, we see large-scale destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, places of worship, cultural sites. We also see restrictions on food, water, medical supplies, electricity, elements that directly tie into the UN Convention's clause about conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. Whether or not the stated military objective is Hamas, these actions still impact Palestinians as a national group. Additionally, genocide scholars emphasize that intent can be inferred from patterns, not just explicit statements. When an overwhelming portion of the casualties are civilians, when basic survival infrastructure is destroyed, when displacement becomes total, and when the state officials have been making dehumanizing statements, the argument that Israel only targets Hamas becomes harder to sustain from a genocide studies perspective. Another flaw in the TikTok caption is that the idea that calling this genocide trivializes actual genocide. In our course, we learned that the opposite is often true. Misusing the term only when killings look like the Holocaust actually narrows the definition in a way that contradicts the UN Convention. Modern genocide scholarship recognizes that genocide can be fast or slow, physical or cultural, overt or structural. So when people, including scholars, human rights organizations, and the UN experts describe what is happening in Gaza as genocide, they are not misusing the term. They are applying the convention's full definition, not just a simplified one of simply killing. Genocide is not only about the number of deaths, it is about the destruction of a people's ability to survive as people. And when we consider this destruction of infrastructures, mass displacement, the targeting of cultural life, and the conditions imposed on Palestinians in Gaza, the claim that this is not genocide ignores the broader framework taught in our class. In other words, using the term genocide is not distorting the debate. It is naming a pattern of violence that fits both the legal criteria and academic understanding that we've learned in class of how groups are systemically destroyed. I hope you enjoyed debunking these with me, and I hope you have a great day. Bye!